And I'll start sharing my screen. Okay, you seeing that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so just want to check. We've not covered Agile in a session, have we?
I'm sorry about the noise, my background.
Sure.
So you were saying that
Yeah. So we're going to be doing Agile tonight, and I was just checking. We haven't done Agile in one of our sessions, have we?
No, I can't remember we doing Agile.
No, I was fairly certain we hadn't. I just wanted to just double check. So normal housekeeping rules. As I mentioned last week, this session is going to be the last session for the summer cohort on project management. There is an assignment at the end of this session, and I wanted to thank you as well for your assignments that you completed on the CRM system. I've had a look at the web forms that you've developed. I haven't looked at Samira's yet, but everybody else's was fine and very good. So can I just ask, how did you find the process? What did you think of the process of creating the web form?
I think it's interesting, and it's not as hard as I thought, because I got a go at it. I had the opportunity to actually practice it and handle it myself.
Yes.
So I think it's quite friendly.
Yes. Yeah. And Elsie, how did you find it?
Thank you, Tony. It was quite simple and straightforward. It wasn't difficult.
Good. And I think, that's one of the things that I was hoping that you would learn from the assignment, was that this Fresh Sales CRM system, it's designed for business people to configure. So it's really designed for smaller organizations that don't have an IT department or don't have a large IT department. And it's really designed so that the business people can set up a lot of the functionality themselves. And that's relatively new in terms of software development, sort of in the 1980s, 1990s, and even into the year 2000s. A lot of IT systems required an IT department to set them up, to install them, to configure them, to get them to do anything useful. But as time has gone on, there's become a market for IT systems that are simpler, where business people can set up the system and can configure it to do the things that the business people need it to do, whilst requiring minimal input from the IT department. Inevitably, there is still some IT expertise required, because the software needs to be installed. There needs to be some disk space where the software can store its data and documents that are uploaded to the system and the like. But the Fresh Sales CRM is a good example of a system that's designed for business people to be able to use and configure. So it's not too complicated, and providing your business requirements are relatively straightforward, then you can configure the system to meet those requirements yourself without needing a long training session and without needing an IT department to back you up. So I thought the assignment was good, because it helped you understand that.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity.
No, that's good. I'm pleased that we were able to give you that opportunity, because it's not something that you'll often get the opportunity to do, is to do that sort of development work, unless there is a system that isn't being used as a live system. We have the luxury with the CRM system that it's currently a trial system, so we can play around with it. I can let students onto the system. You can have a go at doing things, and if things don't work, then that's not a great problem, because when we're ready for the system to go live, we can delete those web forms very quickly and easily and be sure that there's nothing out there that is going to create a problem. So tonight we're going to look at Agile, and Agile as a methodology for delivering projects. And this is an important module for us because Agile is now a very common technique in the project management world. And there's a large expectation that people will have come across Agile, will know what Agile is, how it works, and you might even be asked some questions at interview if you're applying for a job about Agile. So the session tonight is going to look at what Agile means in a project context, and we're going to look at what the advantages are and the disadvantages of using an Agile approach. Our process is going to be, we're going to review Agile in the project context, and then we'll do an assignment on success and failures of Agile. And the payoff will be that you can talk knowledgeably about Agile. Thing to say is we're not trying to make you experts in Agile just yet. For the moment, you just need to have a good appreciation of what Agile is and why it works and why it might not work well in certain situations. And that way you can talk knowledgeably about Agile at interview. And if you can do that, you'll be regarded as a good candidate. So I wanted to start with these two definitions. One is of Agile project management, that's the first one, and the second is of Agile software development. So Agile project management is a method of project management that's characterized by the division of tasks into short phases of work, frequent reassessment, and adaptation of plans. So Agile project management takes things in short steps. It frequently assesses and reassesses to see whether we are heading towards what the project eventually needs to deliver, and it adapts its plans quickly in order to achieve those. The next definition is of Agile software development, and the two are closely related. So Agile software development is an approach to software development under which the requirements and the solutions evolve through a collaborative effort of self-organizing and cross-functional teams and the customers and end users of the solution. It advocates adaptive planning, evolutionary development, so that means building something and then changing it slightly to improve it, and then changing it slightly again. It also advocates early delivery and continuous improvement, and we'll talk about those things. And it encourages a rapid and flexible response to change. So there's a lot in there, a lot of points around Agile. So what is meant by a self-organizing team is a team that manages itself. It's a team that organizes the work within the team. So different people might act as a leader at different times, depending on what work the team is involved in, or there may be no leader, or there may be a number of leaders. The point is the team organizes itself. The teams are also expected to be cross-functional. And what that means is the team will be composed of a number of different skills, or people with those different skills. So you might have some software developers, some business analysts, some project managers, some architects, some software testers, and some users or customers of the system. And the cross-functional team is responsible for delivering something that meets the customer's needs. And it uses all the skills in the team and all the resources of the customers and end users that are assigned to be part of that team in order to deliver the project. And it has this idea about adaptive planning. So it will do some planning and it will adapt, do some planning, do some adaptation. And it will do a similar thing with development. It'll do some development, improve it, do some development, improve it. The idea behind early delivery is that you tend to learn more by doing than you do by thinking about things. This is one of the pieces of learning from earlier methodologies. For example, waterfall methodology. There can be a long time spent planning with waterfall and thinking about the problem, gathering requirements, designing solutions, and you can spend a long time before you actually build something. And it's often only when you build something that you start to really understand how difficult the problem is to solve. So Agile software development recommends trying to build something as quickly as possible, even if it doesn't meet all the requirements, but it does something. So you deliver something as quickly as you can, and then you take that thing that you've delivered and you continually improve it. And you don't worry too much if things change. Waterfall has been criticized in the past for being too rigid, and also for creating a separation between the users of the system and the people who develop it. You might call this a them and us situation, where the two groups of people, the developers and the users, are seen as being separate. Agile says no, they should work as a single team aimed at delivering a solution using all of the skills in that team. And Agile arose from small US-based software developers who started developing software for microprocessors in the 1980s. There were lots of small startup companies that were suddenly able to use the portable computers that became available then to visit their customers, to see the problems firsthand, and to sit down with the customer and work at developing solutions, thus breaking down the barriers between software developers and the end users. And this concept can be extended to cover other situations in projects and in business. So for example, when processes have to be changed, sitting down and working with the end users who perform the current processes can avoid a lot of misunderstandings and really speed up the process of change. Now really, for the Agile method to work, there has to be an ability to make a change and to see the results of the change quickly. For example, if we take this idea of making a process change, you might start by changing the process and just getting one or two operators to use that new process to gather evidence to see whether the change is effective. And that approach would avoid the need to retrain a large number of operatives if the change turns out to be not such a good idea. The downside to approaching the change in that way is you do need to consider the impact of running two different processes alongside each other. But providing you can do that safely, you might pilot a change in that way with a small number of users. But the key point is that you need to be able to change something and see the result quickly. If you can't see the results quickly, if the results take a long time to appear, then actually it's quite difficult to use Agile and you might need to use a different method. We also need to think about unstable systems. So if we can change a system and that causes it to collapse into some undesirable state. So for example, if we change the level of cash held at a bank branch, that could ultimately precipitate a run on the bank. And so it would be unwise to change the level of cash held at all branches at the same time. So when we're thinking about whether to use Agile and how we use Agile, we need to think about, are we going to be able to see the impact of this quickly? And are we going to be able to reverse the change quickly if we find that the change isn't working well for us? Can we make that small change safely in order to see the effect of the change. So that's sort of the basic background to Agile. And you've got this idea that we're going to do things quickly. We're going to make smaller changes rather than big changes, and we're going to monitor the effect of those changes and reassess frequently to see whether we are heading towards our end goal or not. And if we're not, we're going to adapt our plans. And the team is going to self-organize itself around that. So if the team needs to change, the team will change. So that's the basic idea behind Agile, and we'll learn more about it and how it works. So also in the 1980s, the concept of a package solution started to become much more dominant. So rather than software being developed for a single customer on a bespoke basis, package solutions were being developed to meet the common needs of a number of customers. So for example, packages for doing word processing or accounting or project management. Those sorts of package solutions started to become much more common. And as these packages became successful, the customers started to ask for new features, and suddenly the marketing department, which might have been focused on promoting the product, became involved in deciding what features needed to be included in the product for it to sell better, which might be to sell to a wider market. And so the concept of a product owner was born. The product owner was usually a senior marketing manager who had the responsibility for deciding what features were to be included in the next version of the product. And the list of features that have been asked for by customers and prospective users of the product was called a product backlog, because typically there were many more requests than there was time to develop the software to meet the requests. So the request for features would build up, and you would have a backlog. So one of the key roles of the product owner was to prioritize the features that were to be developed next. And the product owner is in direct control of what the software developers are working on or what the project team is working on. It's the product owner who says, these are the features we need next in the product. And the product owner is also responsible for deciding what bugs in the product are to be fixed in the next version. So if a customer finds a fault in a product, you might actually have a situation where 30 or 40 customers have found 100 or 200 bugs in the product. That's not uncommon with a large, complex package solution. And because developer time is limited, the team's time is limited, somebody has to prioritize what the team is going to work on in order to fix those bugs. And that's the role of the product owner. So what they will do is they will have this product backlog, which consists of all the features that people have asked for and all the bugs that need fixing. And the product owner will decide what is going to be worked on and what's going to be left for a subsequent version. And Agile uses this idea of a product owner and a product backlog as a fundamental part of how it works. Somebody has to be responsible for directing the team to say what it is they need to focus on and prioritize. So it was also the case that in the 1980s, new software packages were developed specifically to help with developing software. And these packages improved the speed at which software could be changed safely. And automated software testing solutions started to appear. That also increases the rate at which you can see the effect of a change. And we said earlier that for Agile to work, you had to be able to make small changes and see the effect of those changes quickly. And then you can adjust your approach if the thing hasn't worked. And if it has worked, well, that's great. And These developments in software allowed software developers to safely work on very large software projects as a collaborative team, and for changes to be made and tested quickly. And this in turn means that controlling the versions became easier. So the collaborative teams were able to work on implementing multiple new features at the same time. So you might have a software developer working on feature A, a software developer working on feature B, and two software developers working on feature C. And because of the improvements in how software was developed in the 1980s, it's possible for the teams to work in a collaborative way, but on different features. All of those features being things that the product owner has decided are necessary for the next version in the product. So we have these two concepts. The product owner, who is a person, they get to prioritize the work of the Agile team. And we have a product backlog, which is basically a list of all the features or all the requirements that are needed within a particular solution. And this product backlog list would normally be maintained by the product owner. And it's good practice for them to maintain it in priority order, so they always know what the most important things are, so that if the project team happens to finish the current thing they're working on more quickly than expected, the product owner can give them the next thing that needs working on quickly. Okay. So imagine some word processing software that allowed you to compose a letter, but not to save the letter and not to print it out. That software would be useless because you can't save the letter, you can't print it out, you can't do anything other than just read it on the screen. And that's no good, because when you're writing a letter, you want to be able to send it to somebody. So some software that allows you to compose a letter and put fancy fonts in it and put tables in it and all that sort of thing is useless if you can't save it and print it out. Now, imagine if the software was changed to allow you to print the letter but not to save it. Would that software now be useful? What do you think? What's your view? So if I gave you a word processor and I said you can write a letter and you can print it out, but you can't save the document so you can come back and edit it, would that be useful to you?
Hi, Tony. No, it won't be useful, because if you need it another time, you have to do the work all over again.
Yeah, that's right.
So
that's right.
It's not useful.
Yeah. So if you wanted to use that software that allowed you to print but not save a copy of the letter, one thing you could do is you could print out a copy of the letter. So you could print two copies of it, you could send one and you could file the other. But I think these days, you're right, that would be regarded as being very undesirable, and it would be expected that any modern word processing software would be expected to be able to save the letters electronically so that they could be used in future and used as a starting point for other similar letters. So there is a minimum level of functionality that a software product or any product must have if it's going to be viable in its marketplace. So a word processing product that couldn't save copies of what you create wouldn't be viable in the marketplace, because the marketplace would expect it to have that feature. So we have this concept that's called the minimum viable product. And what we mean by that is that when you're developing a new product, it's likely that there will be a minimum level of functionality or features before any user would agree to use the system, because without those features, it would become too onerous to use the software. So you might get some benefits from using it. You might be able to compose a letter and print it out, but actually, because you would have to retype that letter if you wanted to reuse it, it would just be too onerous to use the software. So we have this concept of a minimum viable product, and what that means is it's the product with the least features that the market would regard as being usable. And it's the product owner, because they're responsible for marketing the product, they are the decision maker as to what functions or functionality must be present in the minimum viable product. Now, there will be pressure to get the product built and released as quickly as possible so that money can be earned from selling the product. So there may be pressure on the product owner to agree to release the product with less than the minimum level of functionality. But the product owner must be careful to resist that pressure, because a premature release of the product might damage the product's reputation irreparably. Because if the product goes to market and it doesn't do what the market expects, there will be bad reviews, there'll be bad feedback, and the product may never recover from that. So it's important when a new product is being developed that the product owner correctly assesses what the minimum viable product is. The product has to be viable in the marketplace for users to want to use it and spend money on it, buying it. And that's like our CRM system. When we were looking around for a CRM system, there were certain features that we knew we wanted the system to have. So we knew it needed to have a customer database. A CRM system without a customer database wouldn't be a viable CRM system. Nobody would buy it because it wouldn't do what you need a CRM system to do. So for CRM systems, there is a minimum viable product. There's a minimum set of features that the product must have for the users to regard it as a worthwhile product. And that's important. When we're running a project and we're trying to deliver a new software system or maybe a new service, we have to try to understand what the minimum requirements for that product or service are, because those requirements will define what our minimum viable product is. Because if the product doesn't meet those minimum requirements, the users won't accept it because it just won't do enough to be useful to them. So this is an important concept for us in Agile, because although we've said that Agile tries to work in small stages, it's an important milestone in an Agile project when it reaches a minimum viable product, because prior to that point, there's nothing that is really usable or of value to the business. So there is a lot of pressure on projects to create a minimum viable product, because that means that they have something that is useful enough that a business person would say, yeah, we can use that. It doesn't do everything we wanted it to do, but it does enough to make it worthwhile starting to use the system and going through the headache of learning to use it. It does enough. So these concepts of product owner, product backlog, and minimum viable product can be related to all sorts of different products, not just software products. They work with cars, with services like perhaps a benefit like universal credit. All of these concepts apply equally to services and products as well as software products. So are there any questions on those three important concepts of product owner, product backlog, and minimum viable product before we move on? Okay. Because it's important that you understand those three things. It's important you understand the role of the product owner, which is to prioritize what needs to be done. To understand that the product backlog is their list of what needs to be done and it's prioritized. And within that list of things that are needed, there will be a minimum number of things that have to be delivered in order for the product to be in any way usable. And we were talking about product-based planning 2 weeks ago. And Agile does integrate with product-based planning and with activity-based planning. Because if in your product-based planning, you've decided you need to create certain products, you can use Agile to create those products. You can create a product backlog for each product. You can have a product owner, and you can use Agile to define the minimum viable product, and you can then use Agile to build on that minimum viable product to deliver the final version of the product that's actually needed. Yeah. So any questions before we move on? Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. So we're going to talk about sprints. Now, sprints are short periods of intense development activity that aim at delivering a working product that can be demonstrated to the end users for them to consider whether the product meets their requirements. And they're designed to be short so that we can minimize the amount of planning and design that we need to do, and also so that we can evaluate the results quickly, because this allows the project to adapt quickly to what's been learned. And this idea of learning by doing is fundamental to Agile. And time boxing the learning activity, so limiting our development to short periods, ensures that we do the development and then we can stop and we can look and reflect at what we've learned before we can move on to the next period of intense activity. And that's really how Agile projects work, is they undertake short periods of intense development activity. They then demonstrate the product to the end users to see whether it's meeting their requirements or not. And if it is, that's great. The team can move on. If it's not, the team can make small changes to try to meet the user's requirements more precisely. And by doing these short periods of intense activity, it means that the project doesn't go in the wrong direction for too long. If the project has made a mistake, if it's misunderstood a business requirement, after this short period, the end users will see the product and say, no, that's not what we meant. We meant this. And end users often find it much easier to describe what they need when they can see something that does it, or something that nearly does it, or something that doesn't do it. They can point out and be much more precise about what they need if they can see something that's close to what they need, but not quite. And this is what Agile is trying to take advantage of. Now, Agile teams, when they're working, they're expected to learn not only about the problem that they're trying to solve, but they're also supposed to learn about how they're working as a team. So they're supposed to learn whether they're effective as a team. They're supposed to think about and reflect after the period of intense development activity, whether they could have done anything better. Could they have worked differently to achieve a better result or achieved a quicker result? And this idea of reflecting not only on the problem you're trying to solve, but how you're working as a team is another important part of Agile. And Agile, because it advocates trying to deliver early, it advocates trying to start the sprints as early as you can. Because that allows the learning to commence as soon as possible. Now, to be able to run a sprint assumes that this multidisciplinary development team and its users have been assembled, that the infrastructure that the team needs for software development and testing to take place, that infrastructure exists and it works, and that there is a prioritized product backlog, and that the product owner has taken a view as to what the first sprint should try to deliver. And so within Agile, there is this concept of something called a sprint zero. So sprint zero is some activity that is undertaken to prove that the team is ready to start this intense development activity that will occur in sprint 1 and subsequent sprints. So sprint zero is a way of ensuring that everything is ready so that you don't try to start sprinting, which is this intense development activity, before you're ready. Now we'll make the point that sprint zero is not a phase of the project in which the team is pulled together. It's a period in which we try to prove that we're ready for the first sprint. So we need the team, we need the infrastructure, we need a product backlog, we need to know what sprint 1's going to work on. We need all of those things. And in that sprint zero period, we'll try to ensure that everything is ready. So we're not actually setting up the infrastructure, and we're not building or prioritizing the product backlog. What we're making sure is that all of those things are in place. They should have all been done before the sprint zero. The sprint zero is trying to make sure that all of that works together. Often it will be the case that sprint zero will be expected to produce something. There will be some feature of the product or something that sprint zero will be expected to produce, because only by producing something real and tangible will you be able to actually prove and measure and test that the team is ready and the infrastructure is ready and the product backlog and the product owner are ready for sprint 1. So it's during the project planning stage, when the development team is formed, when the product backlog is created and prioritized, and when all the setting up of the infrastructure is done, although sometimes the setting up of the infrastructure can be done at the start of the delivery phase. There's no hard and fast rules there about the infrastructure, but the main thing is that when the infrastructure is set up, the sprint zero can be undertaken to prove that the team is ready for these intensive development activities. So we'll go on and learn a bit more about how the sprints work by looking at the sprint cycle. So the sprint cycle really starts with sprint planning. And it's during sprint planning that the product owner and the team work out what it's reasonable to try to do in that sprint and how the work will be done. Remember, we said that the team is self-organizing, so the sprint planning will decide how the work's going to be done. The starting point for sprint planning is the product backlog. The product backlog is the list of everything that the final product needs to have in it. And as part of sprint planning, what the team will do is they will, with the agreement of the product owner, they will select those product features that the sprint is going to attempt to build and test. And it will put those things onto a sprint backlog. And as part of the sprint planning, it will decide in what order those features will be attempted. So the sprint backlog will be ordered according to an order that's discussed and agreed during sprint planning. Okay. And then development will commence. And Agile has this concept of something called a scrum. Now, what a scrum is a daily meeting. They're supposed to be short, perhaps no more than 15 minutes. And during the scrum meeting, the team report back on the progress that's been made and where and why progress hasn't been made. So scrums are an opportunity to identify what may be holding the team up so that the blockages can be cleared quickly. One of the powerful features of the scrum is it does require every member of the team to attend. And when I've worked on Agile projects, the scrum meeting has usually been something like 9:15 or 9:30 in the morning for 15 minutes. So it gives time for people who perhaps have had a problem getting into work to arrive and get settled. But everybody in the team comes to the scrum meeting in the morning. And because everybody's at the meeting, it's an opportunity for everybody to know what's happening in the project. It's an opportunity for any problems to be aired and for somebody to be assigned to clear the problem so that the team can move on. And if it's clear that a problem is going to take a long time to clear, and that means that a particular feature can't be delivered, that feature will typically be taken off the sprint backlog because there's no point trying to deliver something where there is a blocker, a problem to delivering it. So these scrum meetings, these daily scrums, they review the progress that's been made the previous day. They also look at what we're going to do today, and they assign owners for the blockers. They tend to be stand-up meetings because that encourages them to be quick. And at the end, so those daily scrums happen all the way through a sprint. And we have said that sprints are normally short. And in business, in my experience, sprints are usually between 2 and 4 weeks in duration, with 2 weeks being more common. So every day for 2 weeks, you'll have a daily scrum, and the team will work like mad to try to deliver what's on the sprint backlog, so that at the end of that 2 week, 3 week, 4 week period, everything that was on the sprint backlog has been developed and tested. And then there is something called a sprint review. And it's in the sprint review where the tested product is demonstrated to the end users and to the product owner for them to decide whether the requirements have been met or whether further work is required. Where the requirements have not been met at all, they might be put into the sprint backlog. Where they've been partially met, the product owner may agree that they're going to be carried over into the sprint backlog for the next sprint. Or he may say, no, put them back in the product backlog. When we do our sprint planning, we'll think about it then. So it's in that sprint review where you're looking to see, have the requirements been met or is further work needed, and deciding how that further work is going to be handled. The sprint retrospective is another activity that happens before the next sprint planning takes place. And it's in the sprint retrospective where the team gets the opportunity to look at itself, to see how it performed in the sprint, to see what improvements it can make and what lessons can be learned. Now, the project manager will normally attend all sprint meetings. So they'll go to the daily scrums, they'll go to the sprint review, they'll go to the sprint retrospective. But it's really during a sprint retrospective that the project manager has the best opportunity to capture lessons that may have been learned within the sprint that are going to be useful to the organisation and in future projects. And so that cycle that we can see on the screen, that sprint cycle, then continues either until the product backlog is empty, which means you've delivered all the requirements, or until the funding is exhausted, or until the team is exhausted. And sprints are intense periods of activity, and it's actually unusual for any sorry, excuse me. It's actually unusual for any development team to be able to conduct sprints indefinitely. So even though at the end of the sprint, when the daily scrums stop, the daily scrums represent the period of intense activity. Once you're into the sprint review, the sprint retrospective and sprint planning, they're the quieter periods of the project. They're when you get the opportunity to reflect on what's been done, how it could be done better, and what needs doing next. The daily scrums represent that period of intense activity. So in an Agile project, you have periods of intense activity and then periods of quiet reflection, followed by periods of intense activity. Now that can only go on so often because eventually the team does burn out. But essentially the cycle continues until either the product backlog is empty, or the funding for the project has been spent, or the team can no longer undertake the sprints. Now, one of the other ideas that is inherent in Agile is the idea of the team being multi-skilled and cross-functional. And one of the ways in which the team can ensure that it can continue to undertake sprints over a longer period is to develop team members so that they can cover for each other. So that if one individual needs to take a holiday, they can take that holiday, but their work can still be done by somebody else. It clearly also helps if the team is large enough to be able to do the work that needs doing. If the team's too small, there'll be too much pressure on the team to do the work. So having a team that's the right size will allow that team to carry on sprinting and doing its reflection for longer. And Agile does encourage this idea that teams can be multi-skilled, and there's no problem with a project manager doing a BA role, no problem with a BA doing a software developer's role, no problem with a software developer doing a software tester role, because they're all related activities. And if the project needs somebody to do something in order to make progress, then why shouldn't anybody that's able to do that do the work? So this idea of multi-skilled teams is also inherent within Agile. So that's the sprint cycle. Okay. Any questions on sprints and the sprint cycle before we move on? So I guess one question that might be we should perhaps talk about is what's the role of the business analyst in Agile? And
Anthony, I was going to ask the meetings, the retrospective and the daily scrum, who coordinates it, who facilitates it? Is it anybody or?
Sure. So within Agile, there is a role that's unique to Agile, and the role is called Scrum Master. And we'll go on to talk about what the Scrum Master role is and how it's different to the project manager role, because it is different. But usually in projects I've worked in, these meetings, the sprint retrospective, the sprint review, the daily scrums, they will be facilitated by either the Scrum Master or the project manager. And in some cases, those two individuals in those two roles swap and change, because as we were saying earlier, if you have only one person that can do something, then if that person is off ill or needs to take a holiday, does that mean that work on the project grinds to a halt? We can't afford that in an agile project that's trying to be fast moving. So the projects I've worked on, often the sprint retrospective, the sprint review and daily scrums, they're facilitated by the project manager or the Scrum Master, whoever is available and feels like doing it. And we talked about the teams being self-organizing. So it's for the project manager and the Scrum Master to agree who is going to facilitate those things. When we talk about the Scrum Master role, we'll talk about the project manager role as well. So you can see the difference between the two things. Because Agile is such an important technique now, many project managers are being trained in Agile. Many Scrum Masters used to be project managers, and many project managers see becoming a Scrum Master as being something that will further enhance their career. So project managers may want to take on the role of acting as a Scrum Manager, and may even have a Scrum Manager within their project that can be a mentor for them if they want to learn more about that particular role. So we'll come on to talk about the Scrum Master role in just a second. I'll just mention the business analyst role. So the business analyst in Agile is required. It's a fundamental role, and the business analyst is still used to gather requirements, because during the planning phase, one of the more difficult things that we need to establish is how long is the project going to take and how much is it going to cost? Because the stakeholders, the business, the steering group will all be focused on those essential questions. How long and how much money is this going to take? And you can't really begin to assess that until you understand what your minimum viable product is going to look like, because only the minimum viable product will be useful. Anything less than the minimum viable product is not worth anything. It's just not worth having, because the cost of using it is too great. So in order to assess the cost of the project, you need to understand what your business requirements are for your minimum viable product. So it's often said about Agile that you don't gather requirements before you start developing. But in real business projects, in my experience, you have to gather some requirements, and these are the requirements that define the minimum viable product, in order to be able to assess how expensive the project's going to be and how long it's going to take. All estimating is essentially a guess. But if you understand the requirements and you can think about how difficult those requirements are going to be to meet, you start to develop an idea as to how big the team needs to be. That drives the cost of the project, and also how long the project may take to develop your minimum viable product. So the role of the business analyst in the planning stage is to gather business requirements that define the minimum viable product. So they work very closely with the product owner to assemble and to understand the business requirements and to understand the business value of each requirement. So they will help the product owner assemble the product backlog, and they will help in sprint planning, and they'll help create the sprint backlog. They'll also help the software developers understand the business requirements, where they've come from, what they mean. They can help the testers understand how the business requirements might be tested. And they can help the users to express new requirements that come out as the product is being developed and tested, so that the requirement can be properly documented in the product backlog, so that when sprint planning takes place, the requirement has been properly described so it can be developed. So that's the role of the business analyst. And the business analyst may actually be involved in testing or providing test data in order to properly test the solution. So within Agile, there's a lot of work that the business analysts are involved in. Now, the Scrum Master, as we've discussed, the Scrum Master and Project Manager are different roles. The Project Manager is accountable for the progress and would normally provide some direction to the team to ensure progress. Now, the product owner is also trying to direct the team, but the product owner's focus is what the business needs. The project manager's focus is on delivery. It's making sure that something is delivered. And so often the project manager is required to direct the team, even though it's supposed to be self-organizing and self-managing. Some direction, some leadership is normally necessary in order for the team to make progress. And it's the project manager that's accountable for progress. Now, formally, and the slide is correct here, formally Agile would say that the Scrum Master is responsible for facilitating the Scrum meetings. But in practice, both the project manager and the Scrum Master can facilitate Scrum meetings, and it will be up to the two people to decide who is going to actually facilitate each Scrum meeting. And being able to cover for each other is a great benefit to the project. Okay, right. So one of the principal differences between the Scrum Master and the project manager is that the Scrum Master is supposed to be an expert in Agile. They're supposed to be a sort of coach and mentor on Agile and how to use Agile for the best. And so they are supposed to help the team and coach the team on being self-organizing and being cross-functional. So if people start to say, well, it's not my job to do this, it's the Scrum Master's job to step in and say, look, we're a cross-functional team. If you can do it, and we've asked you to do it, you should do it. It shouldn't matter that it's not part of your job description. If you're able to do it, and we need you to do it, you should do it. Because if you do it, the project can make progress. If you don't do it, we're stuck. And so the main role of the Scrum Master is to act as that coach, that expert on Agile working. And while Agile was a new technique, it was necessary for the Scrum Master to keep reinforcing the idea that Scrum meetings should be short and effective at capturing the progress that's been made and identifying what's stopping progress being made. Now, the project manager is also interested in capturing the progress of the project and identifying blockers to make sure they can be removed. And the project manager can take responsibility for removing the blockers that are affecting progress. But the project manager may not be an expert in Agile. That's less the case these days, but certainly in earlier times, the project manager was less of an expert in Agile And so a Scrum Master was appointed to help Agile projects work in a truly agile fashion. So eventually it may be the case that the Scrum Master and the project manager roles become merged in some way. But while they are two separate people and two separate roles, there's certainly advantages to having those two people in terms of them both being able to help the team to operate in an agile manner and to drive progress. So we need to think about whether Agile works or not. And what we can say is that Agile does work well in many situations. It's proven itself to be more capable of delivering what the customer needs in the shortest possible time. It's proven itself that it can produce better results and produce those results more quickly. And these concepts of a self-organizing and multifunctional team also increases employee satisfaction, because people have a core set of skills, but they also get some development and they learn about other skills, and they might decide that actually they enjoy particular aspects of the project more and might even move into that as a longer term career change. So working in a self-organizing team and a multifunctional team does increase employee satisfaction. And the concepts of learning by doing and of time boxing the development effort certainly improve productivity. They make sure that we don't go down the wrong track for too long. We start quickly, we learn quickly, we change our approach if things aren't working, and we don't spend too long on doing the wrong thing. And it's also the case that the stakeholders in the project feel more engaged, because those stakeholders get to work as part of the project team in defining their requirements, in prioritizing them, in testing them, in directing the work. The stakeholders feel more engaged and feel better about the project because they feel more at the heart of it. They're not waiting for a project manager to provide them with a progress report. They attend the Scrum meetings every day, and they can see either the progress that's being made or the reasons that the project's struggling, and they may be able to instantly that day solve a particular blocker. So having the stakeholders working as part of the project team increases the stakeholder satisfaction with the project as well. So we need to, sorry, I'll just go back to the previous slide, sorry. An Agile can prevent project failure because the progress of a project is much clearer using Agile. It's clearer that the project is making progress because you can see that we have a minimum viable product, and each sprint something is being delivered. And at Knowledge Pool, we would recommend Agile as being best practice, especially when it's combined with product-based planning. So product-based planning helps decide what products need to be created, and Agile can help build those products more quickly and to a better level of quality. Now, when we discuss product-based planning, we proposed that the acceptance criteria for the product needed to be defined in the product description. Now, when we combine Agile and product-based planning, if there's any uncertainty as to what the quality criteria for the product should be, it would be best to move into the Agile development stage and to use the close stakeholder engagement that you get during Agile development to discover what the quality criteria are. So you can build something, you can put it in front of the stakeholders and users and say, is this good enough? If it's not good enough, why isn't it good enough? What is it not doing that you need it to do? Is it not reliable enough? Is it not fast enough? Is it not big enough? What's the problem with it? And so that close engagement means that you can understand and develop the quality criteria for the product during the development stage. You don't need to specify them during the planning stage if there's any difficulty doing so. If the quality criteria are easy to define in the planning stage, do it because it's done. But if it's difficult, you can delay finding out what the quality criteria are until development. Okay. So we need to also think about some disadvantages of Agile. But in the intense pressure of sprints and under the pressure to deliver a product that works, quality can suffer. That's been my experience. So in particular, in the area of design, the quality can suffer. Because Agile recommends moving into development as quickly as possible, sometimes the design that's necessary for development to be good, that design doesn't happen. Now, if design is required for a particular sprint, it's supposed to happen during sprint planning. So if something needs to be designed, that's supposed to be done during the sprint planning so that the design is ready for when the scrums and the daily meetings happen. The developers know what the design is that they're trying to build. But one of the problems is that if you design during sprint planning, you're only designing for the requirements that are in the sprint backlog. You're not designing for the requirements that are in the product backlog. And that can lead to situations where the actual designs that are produced, they work for the sprint, but they don't work for the next sprint and the one after that and the one after that. So you have to go back and you have to redesign things. And so the quality of the product can suffer because in some cases it's not possible to do all the design work because all the requirements haven't been gathered. Because one of the things Agile does is it delays the gathering of requirements because it wants to involve users in specifying the requirements. Okay, so another thing that we should talk about is the fact that Agile prioritizes the delivery of a working product over delivering documentation. And that can mean that the product becomes difficult to maintain in the future, especially if the project team is a temporary team. In an ideal world, all members of the project team would go on to maintain the product in future. And so the knowledge that they've built up during the scrums will cover for the lack of documentation. But sometimes the organization can't afford to retain the entire project team after the project has ended. And if there's no documentation, then a lot of knowledge can leave the business when the project team is disbanded. So there can be issues with Agile projects where the product is not adequately documented and therefore it can't be maintained and changed in the future. Now, because only a limited amount of planning is carried out in the planning stage before using Agile, it can be difficult to guarantee that an Agile development can produce a product that meets all the requirements and can do so by a guaranteed end date. So for a regulatory project where the business requirements are specified in some regulations and there is an end date that has to be met, there's an end date that the organization has to comply, the waterfall methodology may be a better method of guaranteeing that all the requirements can be met by the due date. But using waterfall requires all the requirements to be gathered, although that is a little easier because the requirements are usually specified in the regulations. And when you have all the requirements, it requires a design and estimating and planning. And redesigning the project so that you can guarantee that you can build something that will meet all the requirements by the due date. And so waterfall can be a better method if there are business requirements that must be met and a date that must be met. So guaranteeing the coverage of requirements and guaranteeing the end date can be a problem for Agile, and sometimes waterfall can be a better method. Now, Agile isn't really a new method. It's actually been around since the 1980s, although it wasn't always called Agile. It's only since about the year 2000 that the phrase Agile has come into being. So there is some perception that it's a new method. It's not new, but it may be new in certain organisations, and it may be new to certain stakeholders or to the organisation's management team. And they may be nervous about anything that is seen as being new and potentially unproven. And this can lead to a resistance to move away from the traditional way of working. And so it may actually take more effort to use Agile because of that resistance that needs to be overcome. You need to constantly be arguing that it's the right thing to do. But if it is the right thing to do, then it's right to argue the case. So if the Agile method really is new to the team that's going to be using it, the team really must be supported by providing both a Scrum Master that can coach the team and a senior management who support the use of Agile so that stakeholders can be fully engaged with the team and the method. Because there is a perception that Agile requires greater involvement from the stakeholders. And this is because using the waterfall method, stakeholders are used to providing their requirements and then stepping back from the project while the development occurs, only to re-engage with the project when acceptance testing is needed. But the fact that Agile expects stakeholders to be part of the Agile team means that using Agile requires a greater commitment of time from stakeholders during the development stage. But actually that involvement will save time in the planning stage, as we won't need to gather detailed requirements because those detailed requirements can be gathered during the development stage. And the efficiency of Agile actually means that overall, the stakeholders will have to spend a lot less time on the project and they will get a better result. So although Agile does require greater involvement from stakeholders when new stakeholders are introduced to the system, Agile does save them time, and we need to keep reinforcing this with them, that this is going to be time saving for them, even though it feels like they're going to be spending more time on it. And there's a question around scalability. So we can use product-based planning to define a number of different products. Each product can then be developed using Agile, but there can be problems at the point that these products need to interface together, because those products need to interoperate. And the only way to make sure that that's possible is to fully define the interfaces between products during the planning stage. There is another way to do this. One thing you could do is you could have specific sprints where the two development teams come together to work on their respective parts of the interface between two products. So there may be some sprints where each product team works on their own, and then occasionally they will come together for a joint sprint where they will work on the interface between the two products, and the two teams will work as one team in order to make the two products interact together as they need to. And once that interaction has been delivered, the teams may then go back to working independently for a period, building their own features before coming back together again to develop more of the interface. So there are different ways in which the scalability of Agile can be improved. Now, we mentioned earlier that if systems are unstable, or where it can take a long time for the effect of a change to become apparent, it can be difficult to use Agile. If the effect of a change will take years to be seen, or there's only a live system that can be tested, making a change in a short sprint could produce very undesirable consequences, because you could break the system, or you could make a change and not realize that it's going to have devastating effects at some point a long way in the distance. So these are the disadvantages of Agile. And as with any methodology, it's important you understand the advantages and the disadvantages of the methodology so that you can make sure you use the method when it's appropriate, and if it's not appropriate, you use a different methodology. Okay, I do realize that we are running over time. I'm going to try and end by 8:30, so sorry for keeping you so long. Okay, right. So I have an assignment for you. Let me just reply to Yatay. Okay. So our assignment is to do some research on the internet, and I'd like you to try and find an example of where Agile was reported as being successful, very successful. And I'd also like you to try and find an example of a project where Agile didn't work very well, or there was some particular problem that using Agile produced. And what I'd like you to do in order to hand your assignment in is to create a Word document called Agile Intro Assignment with your name. And in that Word document, I'd like you to list the names of the two projects that you found, one where it worked successfully, one where it didn't work, and also links to the web page where you found the information about what worked, what didn't work. So are you okay with that assignment?
Yes.
Yeah.
I am. Yeah. Yes. Are you going to be able to put it on Telegram, please?
Yes, I can put this on Telegram. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I'll do that while we think about it, he says. Right, so let me just grab that assignment. Okay, so we just go to our summary for the course. So Agile recommends that you start developing as soon as you can, because it's only by...
Stop sharing your screen.
Oh, I have stopped sharing my screen, haven't I?
Yeah.
You seeing that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for telling me. So Agile advocates starting developing, and what we mean there really is the development phase of the project as soon as possible, because we've learned that only when you start to actively solve the problem do you actually learn about how difficult it is, what you need to do, what the business requirements are. So Agile proposes starting the development phase as soon as you can. That means that the initiation stage of the project has to be short, and the planning stage of the project has to be short. And the way we do that is during planning, we gather just the requirements that define the minimum viable product. So we have a product backlog that's ready to go into the development stage. And we just use our view of the minimum viable product to estimate the duration and cost of the development phase. And it's in that development stage that we undertake these short, rapid cycles of work, these sprints, where we review and learn and adapt and the teams organise the work for themselves in order that we can first build a minimum viable product. And in some cases, we might actually go live with that. We might take that minimum viable product and we might deliver it to the business. There might be an implementation plan that delivers that project into the business. And while the business gets on and uses that minimum viable product to get the business benefit that it can from it, the sprints may continue and the stakeholders may continue and the team may continue to work on building further improvements to that minimum product in order that eventually the solution does everything that the business needs it to. And we've met these two key roles of the product owner, who defines the priority of the work and directs the team as to what is most important to be working on, and the Scrum Master, who is a coach for the team to make sure that the team is working in an agile manner at all times and is making the most of the agile methodology. And it's actually in that initiation stage, when we're deciding our approach to solving the problem, that we also need to think about whether we're going to be using Agile or using Waterfall, because that will change our project plan. It will change the activities or the products that appear on the project plan. So it's an initiation when we decide whether we're going to use Agile or use Waterfall. So that's our summary on Agile. It's a very interesting and it's a very powerful technique. And I would encourage you to keep reading up about Agile even after you've completed your assignment, to carry on learning how it works, why it works well, and what the components of the methodology are. But tonight we've given you a good introduction to the basics of the methodology, and hopefully you'll be able to use that as a base to grow from. Are there any questions before we wrap up?
Thank you, Tony. Thank you.
Yeah.
No questions from me.
Okay. If questions do occur to you, you're welcome to ask them on Telegram. But if you're okay, I will stop the recording there.
Thank you, Tony. No
Okay.
question from my side.
No problems. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Yes. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.